Chapter 6. General Monastery Issues. 1. Orthodoxy. St. Basil the Great wrote in his discourse on ascetical discipline, quote, "It befits him, that is a monk, not to dispute about Father and Son and Holy Spirit, but he should freely confess in thought and word the uncreated and consubstantial Trinity, and say to them who put this matter to question that we ought to be baptized according to the tradition we have received, and hold the belief in which we have been baptized, and worship according as we have believed." End of quote. Basil the Great's Ascetical Works. Wagner, Volume 9. In the same spirit, Elder Emilianos of Simonopetra stated in the regulations of the Holy Synobium of the Annunciation, or Emilia, Greece, quote, "Following the Orthodox monastic tradition, the Holy Synobium shall confess its faith in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church." Footnote, the meaning of the word here, Catholic, here of course means universal, has nothing to do with the papacy, commonly known as the Roman Catholic Church, which has been condemned unequivocally as a heresy by the Constantinople councils of 1170, 1341, 1450, 1722, 1838, and 1895, as well as by Saints Germanos of Constantinople, Gregory Palamas, Mark of Ephesus, Simeon of Thessaloniki, Paisi Velichkovsky, Nicodemus the Hagurite, Cosmas Etelos, Nectarius Pentapoulos, Justin Popovich, and many, many other contemporary elders. To continue, shall confess its faith in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, in the sacred and holy canons, in the Holy Creed, and in the Holy Fathers, and in whose spirit and tradition it lives, not opposing them at any point. The nuns shall study, learn, experience, and love matters concerning the faith and dogma, though a contentious spirit shall not be cultivated, since this would disrupt and disturb the sanctity and the dignity of the Synobium, shattering and fracturing any possibility of a spiritual life. The abbess, the Urondissa, shall not tolerate any divergence of interference with the faith, but shall direct the community wisely in the Orthodox spirit. End quote. The Authentic Seal, pages 173 to 174. Elder Emilianos. 2. Work. Countless monastic fathers of the Church emphasized the value of manual labor because it leads to humility and salvation, and it enables a monk to support himself and even give alms. St. Athanasius the Great wrote about the monks of Egypt. Each one of them procures so much profit for the monastery every day from their own work and sweat that it is sufficient not only for their own needs, but also for serving the guests and providing for the poor. St. Basil the Great saw the same benefit in work. We must toil with diligence and not think that our goal of piety offers an escape from work or a pretext for idleness, but rather an occasion for struggle, for every greater endeavor. Not only is such exertion beneficial for bringing the body into subjection, but also for showing charity to our neighbor in order that through us God may grant sufficiency to those of the brethren who are in want. It was this understanding of work that led Abba Achilles to say, "Since yesterday evening up until this time, I have been plaiting rope at full pace, though in fact I do not need to do so much work. However, I am working thus, lest God find it necessary to chastise me, saying, 'Why, despite the fact that you are able, do you not work?' Therefore I labor with all my strength." Evangelinos, Book 2, page 48. St. Euphemius the Great also saw the importance of working productively. Quote, "In addition to keeping watch on the thoughts within, monks, especially young ones, ought to practice bodily labor, remembering the words of the Apostle, 'We labor day and night so as not to be a burden on anyone.' 1 Thessalonians 2:9. And these hands ministered to me and to those with me. Acts 20, verse 34. While those in the world endure labor and hardship in order to support their wives and children from their work, and they pay the first fruits to God, they do good according to their own power, and in addition be charged taxes. It is absurd if we are not even to meet the needs of the body from manual labor, but to stay idle and immobile, reaping the fruit of the toil of others, especially when the apostle orders the idle not even to eat. See 2 Thessalonians 3:10, end of quote, of St. Euphemios. The rule of Paul and Stephen understood work as a way to avoid passionate thoughts while also helping the needy. Quote, the apostle Paul said of himself that he labored with his own hands in hunger and in thirst, in cold and nakedness by day and by night, so that neither he nor those with him might lack anything necessary. On the other hand, since we have a second set of clothes and shoes for our own use, and a provision of food daily from the gifts of God, that is more than enough, we exhort you not to love idleness. Rather, each of you should work together, and as you are able, with sincerity and single-heartedness. The monk who does not keep his body busy can never keep his mind free from sordid thoughts. As Solomon says, quote, the lazy are beset by their passions, Proverbs 13:4, and idleness contrives many wicked things, Wisdom of Sirach 33, verse 29. Let those who have been lazy up to now shed this vice, and let them promptly take up every work. For it is written, do not hate hard work or farm work, which was created by the Most High. Sirach 7:15. Then by the Lord's gift and our own work, we can find for ourselves an abundance of goods that we need each day. And we can respond in reasonable and moderate ways to those whom spiritual love invites us to visit. Through our due service, we can help those in grave need by our own labor, for it is certain that the Lord our Redeemer has commanded that it is more blessed to give than to receive, Acts 20, verse 35. End of quote. The Holy Fathers believed that toil is inherent to monasticism. One of the fathers asked Abba John the Dwarf, what is a monk? He said, he is toil. The monk toils at all he does. That is what a monk is. In the same spirit as it, Abba Isidore the priest said, brethren, haven't we come here to find toil? But now there's no more toil here. So I'm going to take my sack and go to where there is toil, and there I will be at rest. With the same understanding of toil being characteristic of true monks, St. Benedict wrote in his rule, if, however, the needs of the place or poverty should require that they do the work of gathering the harvest themselves, let them not be downcast, for then are they monks in truth, if they live by the works of their hands, as did also our forefathers and the apostles. However, on account of the faint-hearted, let all things be done with moderation. He also said, no person is ever more usefully employed than when working with his hands, or following the plow, providing food for the use of man. As written in the Wisdom of Sirach, life will be sweet for the self-reliant and the hard-working. Sirach 40, verse 18. Several saints taught that we will receive a future reward from God for our work. For example, St. Pachomius taught his monks about him who watches over the grinding or the milling. Let them apply themselves to the work they are doing, in the fear of God and without any relaxation, knowing that no good deed that man does for God shall be lost. On the contrary, our good deeds will be a relief to us all on the day of the great judgment. Likewise, St. Ephraim the Syrian wrote, this is no shame for you if you are in obedience in the Lord and do with your own hands what is good, for this distress and this affliction which you endure for the Lord's sake will become for you a cause of eternal life. Evangelinos, Book 1, page 223. St. Basil the Great said, an ascetic should undertake even the most menial tasks with great zeal and eagerness, knowing that everything done for God is not small, but great and spiritual and worthy of heaven, yielding heavenly rewards. Aware of these rewards, St. Joseph the Hesychist, quote, worked very much and would only stop at the times allowed by our schedule. He told me, that is to Elder Ephraim, when a monk comes to realize that he is working for God, he becomes very eager. Some of the early desert fathers worked not for the sake of producing something, but purely for spiritual benefit. For example, from St. John Cassianos, The Institutes, page 233, Ramsey. Abba Paul, one of the most upright of the fathers, lived in the vast desert and could not do any other work to support himself because his dwelling was separated from towns and from habitable land by a 7 days' journey. He used to collect palm fronds and always exact a day's labor from himself, just as if this were his means of support. And when his cave was filled with a whole year's work, he would burn up what he had so carefully toiled over each year, to that extent, proving that without manual labor a monk can neither stay in one spot nor ever mount to the summit of perfection. And so, although the obligation of earning a livelihood did not demand this course of action, he did it just for the sake of purging his heart, firming up his thoughts, perseverance in his cell, and conquering and driving out akadia, or listlessness that leads to depression. End quote. St. Anthony the Great was taught by an angel to alternate work and prayer in order to avoid listlessness. From the alphabetical sayings of the Desert Fathers from Anthony. Once, when the Holy Abba Anthony was residing in the desert, overcome by listlessness and a great darkening of logismo, the thoughts, he was saying to God, Lord, I want to be saved, and my logismi, do not leave me alone. What am I to do in my affliction? How am I to be saved? And going outside his cell a little way, Anthony saw somebody like himself, sitting and working, then standing up from his work and praying, and then sitting down again, and then working at rope braiding, and then standing to pray once more. It was an angel of the Lord sent to correct Anthony and to assure him. And he heard the angel saying, act like this, and you will be saved. He experienced much joy and courage on hearing this, and acting in this way, he went on being saved. St. John Cassian also understood how work safeguards monks from temptations. He wrote, there is a saying among the ancient fathers of Egypt that a monk who's working is tempted by one demon, while an idle one is attacked by a numberless multitude of demons. He also said, it is hardly possible to determine what depends on what here, that is, whether the practice of manual labor ceaselessly thanks to their spiritual meditation, or whether they acquire such remarkable progress in the spirit and such luminous knowledge thanks to their constant labor. The Desert Fathers viewed labor as a means to an end. For example, Abba Isaac in 4th century Egypt taught, since man is weak and unstable and prone to evil, his entire spiritual struggle is focused on the acquisition of purity and dispassion. And this is precisely why we persistently pursue bodily labor. For bodily labor leads to contrition of heart. Likewise, another Desert Father stated, the path that leads to humility is that of bodily labors that beget understanding. Commenting on this, Abba Dorotheus asked, what relationship does bodily labor have with the disposition of the soul? I will explain this to you. When the soul fell away from the keeping of the commandments of God to disobedience, it gave itself over to love of pleasure, having come to love the things of the body. From then on, therefore, this wretched soul has suffered together with the body and conforms with all that it does. This is why the elders said that bodily labor leads to lowliness of mind. Labor, therefore, humbles the soul, and when the body is humbled, the soul is humbled with it. Likewise, Elder Emilianos explained in the regulations of the Holy Cenobium of the Annunciation that manual labor is a commandment of God, an instrument of humility and of bonding between the sisters and a way of contributing to society itself. But work aimed exclusively at increasing wealth or at expending the strength of a nun is a deviation from the monastic way. In the tradition of Cenobitic monasteries, Each monk or nun is assigned his own diakonima. Footnote, a diakonima in the original Greek, which means ministry, is the task assigned to a monk. The Russian word for this, which is the same word used in Russian for obedience, that is, the act of obeying. Because of this, many monastic texts translated from Russian into English call the task assigned to a monk his obedience. But since which of the two meanings of the word obedience is not always clear from the context, we prefer to use the transliterated word diakonima, ministry task. To continue. In some holy monasteries, the monks rotated diakonimata on a regular basis, while in others a monk would keep the same diakonima for years. For example, St. John Cassian described how monasteries in the Holy Land had a different monk to cook each week, whereas in Egypt a monk was appointed to be the cook permanently. Quote, but among the Egyptians, there is no weekly taking of turns, lest, as a result of this activity, anyone be hindered from obligatory work. Instead, the responsibility for provisions and for cooking is committed to a very trustworthy brother who continues to carry out this task with regularity so long as his strength and his age permit. For he is not worn out with any great bodily labor, inasmuch as they do not devote much care to preparing and cooking their food, since they mostly make use of dry and uncooked food, and the leaves of leeks that are cut every month, charlock, granulated salt, olives, and tiny salted fish are their highest pleasure, end of quote, from the Institutes. To continue, St. Sophronia of Essex pointed out the danger of a diakonima being monopolized by only one monk. Quote, for every task, for every diakonima, we must have two people completely capable of doing them so that one may replace the other in the event that some difficulty arises. Otherwise, the monastery's entire life will depend on the eccentricities of whomever, and everything will be stuck. St. Sophronia of Essex reminded his monastics to incorporate love into their work. Begin with a desire to serve others with love, as St. Silouan did, who, when they asked him, served hundreds and thousands of monks in the refectory. He was very happy that Christ loves these people who are God's children, and he served them with great love. This person was simple, but his thought was grand and very pleasant. If you maintain this attitude, then all the necessary tasks of daily life, even those that aim to serve those who come to our monastery, can become like a delicious food for you. And at night, due to this attitude in serving, your heart will be very tender, and you will weep before God because of your failings and because of your love. End of quote from St. Sophronia. When we work, it is important to maintain our inner peace, as Abba Dorotheus taught. Whatever should happen, whether of small or great importance, let us not show undue concern about it, and let us not give it great regard. Of course, indifference is a bad thing, but neither is it once more a good thing for one to become so preoccupied with something that happens that he loses his peaceful disposition, such that the soul is harmed. Be convinced that every task that you fulfill, great or small, as I said earlier, is but an eighth of what is asked of us. Indeed, to maintain your peace, even if thereby you should fail at your obedience, is 4/8 or half of what has been asked of you. Do you see the difference? Therefore, if you undertake some task and you wish to do it perfectly and fully, take care to do it perfectly, which is, as I said, an eighth of the task. But also take care to keep your internal state unharmed, which is 4/8 of the task. If, however, for some reason you drift away from our violate this command, and you or another suffers harm, you've gained nothing, since in fulfilling your obedience, you are losing 4/8 and your peaceful disposition, for the sole purpose of protecting the 1/8. That is the completion of your task. If I should happen to send anyone among you to do any obedience whatever, and you should see any disturbance or harmful thing at all arise, cease immediately. Should one yet see at some moment his neighbor or himself aggravated, stop, back down, and do not persist to the point that there ensues spiritual harm. For it is better, as I say this 1,000 times over, for some work not to come about as you wish, and as the circumstances demand, than stubbornly or according to one's prerogative, since it is obvious that the latter course will upset you and grieve others. You will thus lose the 4/8, and there is a great difference in the harm done. End of quote. Our Holy Father Dorotheus of Gaza. St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain was asked if we should take our time and work slowly in order to maintain our calm, and he replied, from With Pain and Love for Contemporary Man, page 206, yes, because when we work calmly, we maintain our serenity, and then our whole day is sanctified. Our goal should not be to do many things and be in constant anxiety. Furthermore, when he was teaching some boys to learn carpentry, they worked diligently but also took frequent breaks to read from the lives of the saints. If we work constantly, he explained, we will forget God. St. Paisios also taught that one's inner disposition while working is transmitted to the work. To quote, when monastic handicrafts are made with peace of mind and prayer, they are sanctified, and they also sanctify the people who use them. Then it makes sense for lay people to seek these handiworks from us as a blessing. On the contrary, any work made with haste and nervousness transmits this demonic condition to others. Work done with haste and anxiety is the mark of a very secular person. Instead of giving people a blessing, what these troubled souls impart on others with their handiwork is their troubled state. A person's state affects not only the work that he does, but also the materials, the wood that he is using. The final product of a man's work reflects his spiritual state. If he is upset and angry and swears, his work will not bring a blessing to others. But if he chants, if he says the Jesus prayer, his work is sanctified. The first condition is demonic, the other is divine. With Pain and Love, page 192 and 207. To continue. Likewise, Elder Frem said that because his elder, St. Joseph, while cooking, said the prayer constantly out loud, God's grace sanctified the food and made it delicious. Tasks that require little mental concentration are more suitable for monks because they do not hinder prayer. As St. Sophronia of Essex wrote to a monk, if the task is done out of obedience and not out of passion, it will not destroy spiritual peace, but actually build it up. And if in addition it is a very simple task, for example, digging soil, cutting wood, cooking food, and such like, it doesn't prevent one from praying the Jesus prayer while one is actually doing the job. That is why true monks prefer simple work. For the same reason, St. Joseph the Hesychist did not like making wood carvings with great variety or fancy designs with fine details, because the mental concentration needed for such work would captivate the mind and hinder it from turning to God. A nun once asked St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain, when a task is mental, such as a translation, how could one possibly say the Jesus prayer to sanctify the work one is doing? He replied, when the task requires mental concentration, your work will be sanctified when your mind is focused on God. Then you'll be living in the atmosphere of God, even if you are not able to say the prayer. Make sure that you take a short break every 1 or 2 hours and say the Jesus prayer. Another beneficial occupation while working is to chant ecclesiastical music, assuming this would not disturb someone else nearby. The rule of Tarn advised, let the plowman holding his plow handle sing Alleluia. The sweating reaper refresh himself with psalms, and while the vine dresser cuts the curved vine branch, let him sing something from the Psalms of David. Let these be your poems, these, so to speak, your love songs, these the whistling of the shepherd, these the tools of agriculture. St. Athanasius of Athos wanted his monks to sing psalms in order to avoid idle chit-chat. Quote, he did not permit the brethren who were engaged in manual labor to accompany their labors with idle chit-chat, but he made it an unbreakable rule that they were to sing psalms and not engage in idle conversation, so that their work would be blessed and their souls hallowed. From the Holy Men of Mount Athos, page 255. Since, however, the Jesus prayer is much more beneficial than chanting, we endeavor to spend more time praying than chanting. St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain believed that a monk is helped to mature spiritually when he has the freedom to regulate his own work schedule. When he served at the woodworking shop at the monastery of Esphigimenu on Mount Athos, he moved about with spiritual freedom in regard to his scheduled work. For example, on a day prior to when a vigil was scheduled, he worked many hours without rest. On the day after, however, and for as many days as the spiritual condition that had been generated in him by the vigil lasted, he did not go to the woodworking shop, but instead did spiritual work in his cell, study, praying, using his comboschini and prostrations. Thus there were times that he worked in the woodworking shop, for 15 hours a day, and times that he worked spiritually in his cell for 3 consecutive days. That was the type of spiritual freedom that pervaded the monastery of Esphigimenu. Each brother loved the monastery as his home, and also loved his work and his spiritual duties, and in accordance with his spiritual condition, was also able to fully utilize his time in a philotimo-filled way. Having experienced for himself the benefit of that spiritual freedom, he recommended that same spirit be present in Cenobitic monasteries because, as he used to say, it helps the monk to mature spiritually. The monk, he said, must move about with a type of freedom that does not mean that he will have his own will, but that he will utilize his time such that he completely gives himself over, both to chores and to spiritual duties. For this to happen, however, one must cultivate obedience, philotimo, and spiritual nobility. The heart of the monk must be aflame with the spirit of sacrifice. He must love the monastery even more than his home, otherwise he may fall into the habit of loafing about. In other words, freedom is very good, but if there is no philotimo, it can be dangerous. End of quote. St. Paisios warned of the danger of becoming attached to one's work. Give your legs and your hands to work, but not your heart. In other words, you should not give your heart to the material things. Some people give their whole self to material things. They spend the entire day trying to do a job well and don't think of God at all. When a task is simple, it helps if the mind is not absorbed by it. But when the task is complex, then it makes sense to become somewhat absorbed mentally, but don't let that take over the heart. When you work, you should not forget Christ. Do your work joyfully, but keep your mind and your heart focused on Christ. If you do this, not only will you not get tired, but you will also be able to do your spiritual work. St. Paisios also warned of the dangers of working excessively. This time from his epistles, page 125, to quote, "Those who work too hard are full of worries. They forget God. It is advisable for people who wish to live spiritually, especially monastics, to avoid certain pursuits which obstruct them from their spiritual goal. They should not get involved in endless tasks, and there is never an end to work. If monks or nuns do not learn to do the internal spiritual work, they will seek to escape in external activities. People who attempt to complete endless tasks will end their lives with all kinds of spiritual imperfections. Many times, unfortunately, even a monk will be deceived and draw a worldly form of pleasure from his work. It is in man's nature to do good because his Creator is good, but the monk is striving to transform himself from a human being into an angelic being. This is why, when it comes to material things, his work must be limited to the bare necessities so that he will have time for spiritual work. Then, the joy that he feels will come from the fruit of his spiritual labor. It will be a spiritual joy, abundant nourishment for himself and for everybody else. Much care is needed so as not to expend all our bodily strength on handiwork. For if we're careless, we won't be able to carry out our spiritual duties, or we will do them but without motivation, waiting impatiently for our prayer rule to come to an end. End of quote. And to conclude on work. One holy tradition that helps us not to be too caught up in endless tasks is to rest from work on Sunday. The holy canons state, quote, Christians must not Judaize and rest on Saturday, but must work on this day, preferring to rest as Christians on Sunday if we're able to do so. Therefore, on Sundays and great feast days of the Church, we only do work that is absolutely necessary, that is, cooking, washing dishes, caring for any plants and animals that require our daily attention, and so forth. Other tasks that are not time-sensitive, such as construction, are not done on such days, even though it could be justified by the reasoning that it is for the Lord and therefore permissible on the Lord's day. The Greek word for the Sunday is Kyriaki, the Lord's day. Such a justification is following the letter of the law, rather than the spirit of the law. Sundays, the Lord's day, should not merely be a day of minimal work, but should also be a day devoted to spiritual tasks, and thus truly be the Lord's day. St. Ignatius the God-bearer wrote to laymen, Let each one of us take his Sabbath spiritually by rejoicing in meditation of the law, not in comfort of the body, not in dancing and noises in which there is no sense. In the same vein, St. Athanasius of Athos wrote to his monks, It should be noted that we must not spend the days on which we're free from manual labor in idleness and laughter, but rather in prayer and reading, so that on feasts such as these we may receive enlightenment of soul and spiritual grace, and not condemnation. 3. Hardship. Enduring hardships is such an essential aspect of monasticism that it has been included in the Catechism of receiving the monastic schema as follows. If, therefore, you have chosen to follow him in truth, and if you ardently desire to be called, not falsely, his disciple, be prepared from this present time, not for comfort, nor for freedom from care, nor for physical nourishment, nor for any of the pleasing and sweet things upon the earth, but for spiritual struggles, for abstinence of flesh, for purity of soul, for spiritual and bodily poverty, for sincere mourning, for all the sorrowful and painful things of the joy-giving life in God. For you must be hungry and thirst, and endure nakedness, and accept reproach and ridicule, insult and persecution, and lay up many other grievous things by which life in God is distinguished. From the Great Book of Needs. To continue, St. Basil the Great warned against living a soft life. I chastise my body and bring it into subjection, 1 Corinthians 9:27, lest at any time, because my blood is in good condition and overheated, my corpulence may become an occasion of sin. Do not flatter your flesh with sleep and baths and soft coverings, but say always these words, What profit is there in my blood, whilst I go down into corruption? Psalm 29, verse 8. Why do you treat with honor that which a little later shall perish? Why do you fatten and cover yourself with flesh? Or do you not know that the more massive you make your flesh, the deeper is the prison which you're preparing for your soul? End of quote, Basil the Great. In the same spirit, St. Eustathius of Thessaloniki wrote to a monk, You have selected the rough life. Why are you now following the easy way, which is dangerous and will likely lead to defeat? You have already chosen the harsh life. Therefore, you should avoid delicate living. St. Isaac the Syrian explained, The path of God is a daily cross. No one has ascended into heaven by means of ease. He also said, Afflictions suffered for the Lord's sake are more precious to him than every vow and sacrifice. and the odor of their sweat surpasses every fragrance and choice incense. Regard every virtue performed without bodily toil as premature, stillborn fruit of the womb. Ascetical Homily number 59. Elsewhere he wrote, "Ease and idleness are the destruction of the soul, and they can injure her more than the demons. The demons are unable to act where the soul resides in light, that is, in laudable labors of virtue." St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain agreed. He wrote, "The easy life does not help. Comfort is not appropriate for a monk. It's a disgrace for those living in the wilderness. Perhaps you were raised spoiled, but now, if you're in good health, you must get used to hardship. Otherwise, you are not a true monk. Deprivation helps a lot. When people are deprived of something, they come to appreciate it more. When we deprive ourselves voluntarily with discernment and humility for Christ's love, we feel spiritual joy. Today, most people are not deprived of anything, and for this reason they lack philotimo, sacrifice for others. If one has not worked hard, he cannot appreciate the hard work of others." End of quote from With Pain and Love for Contemporary Man. Yerda Emilianos of Simano Petra also noted the spiritual value of deprivation. He said, "Only a person in deprivation while being content with what he has can love God and have a spiritual life." St. Paul said, "I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am, and I've learned to be in want." Philippians 4:11-12. He who has learned how to be in want is happy. He who desires to have everything, just in case he catches a cold or is in pain or gets a little wet or tired, is incompetent for survival. But the more you learn to bear suffering, the more you become a suitable instrument of God's grace. St. Gregory of Sinai explained in more detail the importance of toil. Quote, "Here we should set forth the toils and hardships of the ascetic life and explain clearly how we should embark on each task, lest someone who coasts along without exerting himself, merely relying on what he has heard, and who consequently remains barren, should blame us or others, alleging that things are not as we've said. For it is through travail of heart and bodily toil that the work can properly be carried out. Through them, the grace of the Holy Spirit is revealed. This is the grace that we and all the faithful are given at baptism, but which, through neglect of the commandments, has been stifled by the passions. No activity, whether bodily or spiritual, unaccompanied by toil and hardship bears fruit. For the kingdom of heaven is entered forcibly, says the Lord, and those who force themselves take possession of it. Matthew 11, verse 12, where forcibly and force relate to the body's awareness of exertion in all things. Many people for many years may have been working spiritually without exerting themselves, or may still be working in this way, but because they do not assiduously embrace hardships with heartfelt fervor and have repudiated the severity of bodily toil, they remain devoid of purity, without a share in the Holy Spirit. Those who work spiritually, but do so carelessly and lazily, may think that they're making considerable efforts, but they will never reap any harvest because they have not exerted themselves and basically have never experienced any real tribulation. A witness to this is he who says, "However exalted our way of life may be, it is worthless and bogus if our heart does not suffer." Ladder of Divine Ascent, Step 7. Sometimes, when we fail to exert ourselves, we are in our listlessness carried away by spurious forms of distraction and plunged into darkness, thinking we can find rest in them when that is impossible. The truth is that we are then bound invisibly by unloosable cords and become inert and ineffective in everything we do. For we grow increasingly sluggish, especially if we're beginners. For those who have reached the stage of perfection, everything is profitable in moderation. The great Ephraim also testifies this when he says, "Persistently suffer hardships in order to avoid the hardship of vain sufferings." For unless, to use the prophet's phrase, Our loins are exhausted by the weakness induced through the exertions of fasting. And unless, like a woman in childbirth, we are afflicted with pains arising from the constriction of our heart, we will not conceive the spirit of salvation in the earth of our heart. Isaiah 21, verse 3, and Isaiah 26, verse 18. Instead, all we will have to boast about is the many profitless years we have spent in the wilderness, lazily cultivating stillness and imagining that we are somebody. At the moment of our death, we will all know for certain what its fruits was. A text attributed to Saint Athanasius the Great emphasized the need for tremendous labors. The saints despised this world, he wrote, knowing what good things they were about to inherit. Thus, he who has rest in this world should not hope to receive the eternal rest. For the kingdom of heaven does not belong to those who rest here, but to those who seek that life in great affliction and anguish. For they who have received the kingdom have not received it free, but with tremendous labor and copious sweat. Archimandrite Zacharias of Essex explained why monastics need hardship. The Lord said that we enter the kingdom through the straight gate, through the narrow way, Matthew 7:14. Monasticism tries to create this narrow way for us to go through and to leave behind the old skin like the snake. The snake goes through a narrow hole in order to leave behind its old skin, and it comes out with a new one. Monasticism tries to organize life in a way that will give the monk opportunities to endure certain hardships, so that he may thereby leave behind the old skin. From Zacharias is the enlargement of the heart, page 243. Even the non-Orthodox have observed that hardships and suffering in general are what forge character. As Edwin Chapin put it, out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars. As Cyclus wrote, wisdom comes alone through suffering. Henry Ward Beecher said, we are never ripe till we have been made so by suffering. And Louis E. Bish observed, suffering is a cleansing fire that chars away triviality and restlessness. The underlying principle is that moderate challenges are what strengthen us. In the realm of physical strength, bodybuilders select weights that are neither trivially light nor impossibly heavy to lift. Likewise, in the realm of mental strength, educators present to pupils concepts and problems that are neither obviously self-evident nor completely unfathomable. So too, the spiritual realm. We who want to increase our spiritual strength will benefit by facing challenges and temptations that are neither trivial nor overpowering in magnitude. In the words of the holy prophet Isaiah, with a small affliction thou didst instruct us, Isaiah 26, verse 16, Septuagint. St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain pointed out that toil strengthens both our body and our soul, whereas modern conveniences, they do the opposite. Quote, in the past, people worked with tools that made them stronger. Nowadays, the tools that we use at work make us need physiotherapy and massages. When conveniences become excessive, man is rendered useless and lazy. Even though we can turn something by hand, we think to ourselves, no, I'll just press a button and it will turn by itself. When someone gets used to doing things the easy way, he wants to have it easy all the time. Modern comforts have stupefied people, and the sloth we see in so many today has brought on many diseases. Footnote, Dr. Jean-Claude Larcher made a similar observation. Quote, the development of domestic appliances reduces physical activity in a way that harms health. Well, this reduces or eliminates, for the habitually inactive, even the light activity of household chores that might have improved their body tone. From the new media epidemic, the undermining of society, family, and our own soul. Specifically, numerous studies have shown that physical exertion of the body improves sleep quality, stress levels, mood, self-esteem, mental focus, bone density, muscle mass, cardiovascular health, gene expression, skin quality, blood pressure, cholesterol, metabolic rate, the immune system, insulin sensitivity, lung function, strength, endurance, coordination, balance, flexibility, life expectancy, and overall fitness. It also decreases the risk of coronary disease, diabetes, strokes, dementia, migraines, cancer, glaucoma, and injuries. Exercise has also been shown to reduce the intensity of the following chronic health conditions: osteoporosis, depression, Parkinson's disease, arthritis, and fibromyalgia. Furthermore, a physically strong body mitigates the effects of aging. To continue, modern comforts have stupefied people, St. Paisios quote, and the sloth we see in so many today has brought on many diseases. In the past, it would take so much work just to thresh the wheat. The labor was hard, but then the bread was so sweet. Footnote: hard-earned bread is sweet because accomplishments require exertion, whether they're spiritual, mental, or physical, naturally give rise to a wholesome satisfaction. Labor-saving devices deprive us of this. Because modern conveniences have exceeded all bounds, they've become inconveniences. Machines have multiplied, and so have distractions. Man has been turned into a machine. All of these modern comforts make the cultivation of conscience in people difficult. In the old days, people used to work with animals and were more compassionate. If you overloaded an animal and the poor thing kneeled down from the weight, you felt bad for it. Today, people own lots of devices made of steel, but unfortunately, even their own hearts have turned into steel. Make sure that you advance in spiritual matters and not in equipment and comfort. Do not take delight in these things. If monasticism abandons the ascetical life, it will not be monasticism anymore. If you put convenience above monasticism, above asceticism, you will not prosper. The monk avoids conveniences because they do not help him spiritually. In doing our chores, we sometimes may try to justify the use of machines or other conveniences to do our work faster and have more time for our spiritual life. As a result, our life becomes stressful, full of concerns and anxieties, and we come to resemble the lay people rather than monks. Technology can offer some help for daily needs. However, where do the needs end? One thing leads to another, and we become unable to stop at any given point. Simplify your needs and cast the daily cares out of your life. One day, Elder Theophylactos of New Skete saw Satan going past the huts of the Skete with his tongue out, mocking the monks and saying, "Ha ha ha, the monks have abandoned the Jesus prayer and have worldly distractions. They have got lots of work to do." When some monks had installed the telephone link in the Skete, Elder Theophylactos had seen St. John, the holy foreigner and Baptist, looking very sad. To conclude, St. Sebastian of Optina also understood the value of physical labor and avoiding ease, for when he was somewhat younger and stronger in health, he refused to use transportation, saying, "I'm a monk, I should go on foot and not ride," and we would walk long distances. 4. Poverty. St. Sophronia of Essex explained what is meant by monastic poverty. In the work Truth and Life, pages 101 and following, quote, "The third basic monastic vow, that of non-acquisition, known in the West as the vow of poverty, naturally completes the first two, vows of obedience and chastity, and with them forms an indissoluble unity for the attainment of pure prayer, and at the same time a more perfect identification with God through likeness to Christ, who has so little concern to possess the things of this world that he had not where to lay his head." Matthew 8:20. Experience shows every man that in order to arrive at pure prayer, it is essential to free the mind from burdensome preoccupation with material possessions. The monastic vow To renounce the spirit of acquisitiveness stresses the struggle against the passions for acquiring and the love of money and things. The monk promises not so much to live in poverty as to free his spirit from the desire to possess. The sign of success here is the appearance of a powerful desire not to possess, so that the true ascetic does not even spare his own body. Only thus is it possible to live a really royal life of the spirit. The love of possessing banishes love for God and one's fellow man. People do not see this and do not want to understand that their unrighteous aspirations are the source of the sufferings of the whole world. St. John Climacus says, love of money, that is, cupidity, is called the root of all evil. And this is indeed so, for covetousness gives rise to theft, to envy, separations, enmities, cruelty, hatred, murder, and wars. Therefore, to break free from the bondage of petty cares in order to purify our minds and allow our spirits to delight in a truly imperial liberty, or more exactly in a godlike liberty, renunciation of this sphere, too, is essential. St. Basil the Great began his discourse on ascetical discipline by stating, first and foremost, the monk should own nothing in this world. And St. Synclitique taught, quote, poverty, for those who can endure deprivation, is the greatest good. Those who endure it suffer in the body, on the one hand, yet, on the other hand, grant comfort and delight to their souls. Just as well-made clothing is washed and made clean, the more that one beats it and wrings it out, so the more one beats and wrings out the strong soul, with willful monastic poverty, the more it is strengthened. On the contrary, those souls that are ill in thought and show love for ruinous material goods come to suffer. These souls, as soon as they are beset, even slightly by material deprivations, are lost. Just as worn and torn clothing cannot withstand washing, so in the same manner these souls are lost, since they cannot withstand the harsh cleansing of virtue. The Lord addressed these same people who seek the virtues, saying, take no thought for the morrow, Matthew 6:34. Behold, the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them, Matthew 6:26. And these poor people, having nothing, the devil has few ways to harm them, since the majority of sorrows and gains follow on the heels of incursions for the purpose of looting money. Hence, where there is poverty, the nemesis of our souls can do no evil. Do they have holdings to burn? Indeed, they have none. Beasts of burden to kill? Where to find such things? An opportunity to harm their beloved relatives? They too have been left behind. From all of this, we can conclude that monastic poverty constitutes the greatest victory over the enemy and is the most valuable treasure of life. End quote, St. Synclitique from the Evangelinos, 4th book, pages 6 to 7. To continue, St. Ephraim the Syrian said, a monk who loves material things is like unto a barren palm tree. Contrarily, a poor monk is like a palm tree rich with leaves, and which rises up to heaven. Antioch of the Pendex added, quote, poverty indicates that the monk who applies it in his life is sincere. The monk who has no possessions resembles an eagle who flies high above the earth. The monk who has not a single possession shows himself to be only temporarily on earth. Since he has acquired none of the temporary goods of this world, by this indifference to them it is obvious that he desires things eternal. A poor man mimics, by his poverty, Elias, John the Baptist, and the disciples of the Lord. Like them, he can say, behold, we have forsaken all and followed thee. What shall we have, therefore? Matthew 19, verse 27. And he, like them, will hear that which the Savior said, you, having abandoned all and having followed me, shall receive 100-fold and shall inherit everlasting life. Matthew 19, verse 29. In the same spirit, St. Gregory Palamas said, quote, Let us cleanse the eye of our understanding by reaching up with our deeds, words, and thoughts towards God. There would be nothing to drag us down if we were only to look as far as we can at John the Baptist's way of life. He went around without a roof over his head, so let us be content with a small shelter, and may each of us gladly accept the modest room which the Superior gives us, remembering him who was homeless all his life long. He was satisfied with locusts, the name of a type of fruit, and wild honey. Footnote, see the homilies of St. Gregory Palamas, homily number 40, on this to continue. A plant which grows wild in the desert, the roots of which were used as food by the Holy Fathers who dwelt there after him. So he lived on fruit and plant roots, or honey from the mountains, had only one garment, and wore a girdle of skin about his loins, thus showing that he possessed the virtue of poverty. An ascetic elder in the Eurondicon explained, "Greatly love poverty, do not desire to have valuable objects and various other material goods in your cell. When your soul seeks something and does not attain it, it sighs and is humbled. Indeed, in this condition, God intervenes and comforts your soul, granting it compunction." St. Isaac the Syrian had much to say about the benefits of poverty and non-possessiveness. "Love poverty with patience," wrote St. Isaac the Syrian, "that your mind may be collected and secured from wandering. Detest superfluity, that you may preserve your thoughts untroubled. Nothing brings such serenity to the mind as voluntary poverty. Without non-possessiveness, the soul cannot be freed from the turmoil of thoughts, and without stillness of the senses, she will not perceive peace of mind. No one can achieve true non-possessiveness unless he resolves within himself to endure tribulations with gladness. And no man can endure tribulations unless he believes that there is something more excellent than bodily comfort, the which he will receive in recompense for the afflictions that he has prepared himself to undergo. The love of afflictions must first have stirred in the man who has prepared to deprive himself of possessions. For only thereafter does the thought come to him to possess none of the things of this world. And every man who draws nigh to affliction is first made steadfast by faith, and then he approaches afflictions. The beginning of the path of life is continually to exercise the mind in the words of God and to live in poverty. For when a man waters himself with one, it aids in the perfection of the other. That is to say, to water yourself with the study of the words of God helps you in achieving poverty, while achieving freedom from possessions affords you the time to attain to constant study of the words of God, and the help provided by them both speedily erects the entire edifice of the virtues. From Homily 1. To continue Isaac the Syrian. The more the mind takes leave of care for these visible things, my beloved brethren, and is concerned with the hope of future things according to the measure of its elevation above care, the more it is refined and becomes translucent in prayer. And the more the body is freed from the bonds of worldly affairs, the more the mind is also made free. Therefore the Lord gave as a commandment that before all else a man should hold fast to non-possessiveness and withdraw from the turmoil of the world, and release himself from the cares common to all men. He said, "Whosoever forsaketh not his entire human state and all that belongeth to him, and renounceth not himself, he cannot be my disciple." Luke 14, verse 26. From Homily 63, Ascetical Homilies. Isaac the Syrian continues, "As long as a man chooses to be free of possessions, departure from life always arises in his mind. He makes the life after the resurrection his continual study, and at all times he contrives to make preparation that will be useful yonder. He acquires disdain for every suggestion of honor and bodily ease that is sown in his thoughts, and the thought of scorning the world is lively in his mind at every moment. His mind becomes bold, and he acquires a heart that is always strong and courageous in every fear and danger of impending death, and he does not even fear death itself because his attention is always upon it as something that approaches him, and he awaits it. Excerpt from Homily 74. And to conclude the excerpt from Homily 63, the love of God, therefore, comes by converse with him. The converse of prayer comes through stillness, Hezekiah. Stillness, Hezekiah, comes through non-possessiveness. Non-possessiveness through patience. Patience through the hatred of passionate desires. The hatred of passionate desires is born of the fear of Gehenna and the earnest expectation of blessings. Passionate desires are hated by the man who knows their fruits and what they prepare for him, and of what good things they deprive him. Thus every discipline is connected with that which is higher. But if one of these middle ones should fail, those following will be unable to stand, and it will appear that all are undone and lost. What is more than this lies beyond explanation. Furthermore, St. Isaac the Syrian believed that afflictions stemming from poverty have a beneficial effect on the soul. He wrote, "How much benefit, thanksgiving, and humility is produced by the incursion of these spurs of afflictions is an easy matter for all to learn for themselves. God has made these instructors plentiful for you, lest being free from them and immune to and having no part in tribulations and feeling yourself superior to every fear, you should forget the Lord your God and turn away from him and fall into believing in many gods, just as many have done. For although these men had a passible nature like your own, were subject to want, and were scourged with these very griefs, yet in a brief space of time, because of paltry riches, fleeting power, and ephemeral health, they not only fell into polytheism, but in their madness they had the audacity to declare themselves God by nature. For this reason, then, he has made his remembrance abound in your heart by means of sufferings and griefs, and he has spurred you toward the gate of his mercy with the fear of hostile forces. And by means of deliverance from these things, he has implanted in you seeds of love for him. Then he will cause you to perceive both the holiness of his glory and the secret mysteries of his nature's goodness. Whence could you have known these things, if adversities had never befallen you?" The excerpt from Homily number 5 of St. Isaac the Syrian. To continue. Despite the many spiritual advances of lacking possessions, the primary danger of possessions is being attached to them. Abba Zosimas always liked to say, it is not possessing something that is harmful, but being attached to it. Although Abba Galasios demonstrated that it is possible to maintain an inner non-possessiveness while living in a monastery with many possessions. A footnote from the alphabetical sayings of the Desert Fathers. Galasius, number 5. They used to say to him, that is Abba Galasius, that he undertook a life of poverty and withdrawal in youth. There were many others who at that time embraced the same way of life as he, in the same parts. Among them was an elder of supreme simplicity and poverty, living alone in one cell until he died, even though he had disciples in his old age. He disciplined himself until death to observe the commandment not to possess 2 tunics, nor together with his companions to take thought for the morrow. When, at the instigation of God, Abba Galasius came to set up the cenobium, much land was offered to him. He also acquired beasts of burden, oxen, for the needs of the cenobium. He, that is an angel who at first revealed to the godly Pachomius that he should set up a cenobium, was working with this father too in all that concerned the setting up of the monastery. The above-mentioned Yeronda, seeing him immersed in these things and maintaining a sincere affection for him, said to him, "Abba Galasius, I am afraid that your thoughts, your thinking, your logismos, is attached to the lands and the rest of the property of the cenobium." To which he replied, "Your logismos is more attached to the needle with which you work than is the logismos of Galasius to the property." To continue. Yeronda Frem commented that this feat of Abba Galasios is extremely difficult. Monks have taken a vow of poverty, and ideally have forsaken all things in order to follow Christ and attain perfection. As Christ said, "If thou wilt be perfect, go, and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come and follow me." Matthew 19:21. If this ideal is implemented by living simply, a significant result will be that people who see monks without fancy conveniences will be inspired by their genuine dedication to the gospel rather than scandalized by their luxuries. This is crucial, for as St. Isaac the Syrian taught, the monk ought to be in his appearance and all his actions an exemplar of profit for those who see him. And he warned, "He who creates temptations for laymen will not behold the light." Likewise, St. John of Sinai wrote that the monastic life is a light for all men, and they should give no scandal in anything they say or do, for if the light becomes dark, then all the deeper will the darkness of those living in the world. If our calling as monastics is to be a light to laymen and to inspire them by our good example, we may fall short of living up to this calling if they see us living with just as many, if not more, worldly comforts as they have. Elder Ephraim was very concerned about people being scandalized when seeing monks owning something fancy. For example, when someone wanted to buy him a brand new luxury car, he was appalled at the extravagance and was strongly opposed to having something so fancy. He refused to accept that car, also because he was concerned about what people would say when they saw a monastery having something so luxurious. He wanted to get a good used car instead, for 1/3 of the price, or a less luxurious new one for half the price. St. John Chrysostom was also concerned about the impression made on laymen by what monks possessed. Quote, "And their monks' dress is suitable to their manliness, for not indeed like those with trailing garments, the enervated and mincing are they dressed, but like those blessed angels, Elijah, Elisha, John, like the apostles, their garments being made for them, for some of goat's hair, for some of camel's hair, and there's some for whom skins suffice alone, and these long worn. When a poor man shall see monks who are the children of rich men and descendants of illustrious ancestors clothed in such garments, is not even the lowest of the poor, and rejoicing in this, consider how great a consolation against poverty he will receive as he goes away." St. Palladios also pointed out the benefit of merely seeking a monk with humble attire. The appearance of their faces abloom with gray hairs and the arrangement of their dress, together with their conversation so free from arrogance, and the piety of their language, all this, and the grace of their thoughts will increase your strength, even should you be afflicted with spiritual dryness. The attire of the man and the gait of his feet and the laughter of his teeth show him for what he is, as wisdom says, Sirach 19, verse 30. Moreover, we should embrace poverty not merely for the sake of what other people might think of us, but also for its inherent spiritual benefit. Christ warned us, "How hardly shall they that have riches enter into the kingdom of God," Luke 18:24. And he said to them all, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, but whosoever will lose his life for my sake, the same shall save it." Luke 9, verse 23 and following. This is why the 5th century Syriac rules of Rabula declare, "All those who have become disciples of the Messiah shall not be covetous to possess more than their needs, and they shall distribute it to the poor." In the same spirit, St. Nilus Sorsky wrote, "We must not have in our own possession in ourselves any dishes or any objects of great value and beauty. So also the structure of the hermitage and the other buildings of the Skeet monastery should be built of cheap and unadorned materials, as Basil the Great says, namely, that the building materials should be easily found everywhere and purchased at low cost, nor should these be the cause for any cares and preoccupations and worries, so that we do not fall into contact with the spirit of the world." Chariton, the superior, wrote of the importance of poverty for monastics in his testimony for Kutlu Monastery on the Holy Mountain from the Byzantine Monastic Foundation documents, quote, I beg them, that is the monks, call upon them, and as a father I advise them that they preserve poverty as the paternal inheritance we have received from those old monks whose memory is eternal. The monks are well aware of the benefits which derive from poverty. Is there any way in which monks who have made promises to deny the world and what is in the world can then justify betraying their promises? They have to face the wrath of God, because not only have they not denied themselves according to the commandments and taken up their cross and followed, but on the pretext of fulfilling the Savior's command which forbids giving to God, they strive for something else, end quote. Elder Arsenios Boca said, whoever for God's sake lives in poverty acquires a treasure that is never lost. The more a person renounces worldly comforts, the more he is counted worthy of enjoying the delights and blessings of God through the Holy Spirit. The further away from the world you are, the nearer you are to God. St. Ignatius Bryanchaninov explained why poor and simple buildings help monastics achieve their goal. From The Arena, pages 157 and following, quote, it was not without reason that the Holy Fathers observed extreme simplicity in their clothing and the furniture and appurtenances of their room or cell, in their monastic buildings, and even in the construction and adornment of their churches. The thought and heart of a weak person correspond with his or her outward circumstances. This is something quite incomprehensible for inexperienced and inattentive people. If a monk wears elegant clothes, if his cell is carefully furnished with an air of taste and luxury, if even the churches of a monastery are magnificent buildings, shining with gold and silver, and provided with rich vestries, then the monk's soul will certainly be vainglorious, full of conceit and self-satisfaction, and he will be a stranger to compunction and the realization of his sinfulness. Filled with vainglorious pleasure and gratification, which is taken for spiritual joy, such a soul remains in darkness, self-delusion, hardness, and deadness, as if in the midst of a triumphant festival. On the other hand, when a monk's clothing is simple, when he lives like a pilgrim in his cell, as if he were in a tent or in a hut, and has only what is essential in it, when the church serves as a place of prayer and thanksgiving, confession and weeping, without distracting and enrapturing him by its splendor, then his soul borrows humility from his outward surroundings, is detached from everything material, and is transported in thought and feeling to that unescapable eternity that confronts all men. Such a soul endeavors by repentance and the fulfillment of the holy gospel commandments to prepare himself in good time for a blessed reception in eternity. End of quote, St. Ignatius Bryanchaninov. St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain also saw great inherent benefit in monastic poverty and simplicity. To quote from the epistles and from With Pain and Love for Contemporary Man. I know monks who cannot really enjoy the spiritual spirit. They rejoice in the worldly spirit. They have never felt this thrill of joy, the joy that comes from simplicity. Austerity is a great help to the spiritual life. A monk should only own what he needs and what befits him. He should limit himself to what will ease his life a bit and not aspire to worldly possessions. For example, a military blanket will take care of his needs. He does not need a colorful or embroidered blanket. This is how simplicity and spiritual valor set in. Give things to a monk and you will destroy him. It's when he rids himself of what he owns that he finds rest. Collecting things will destroy a monk. Monks should love the poverty that they promised God they would observe. Unfortunately, however, they do not limit themselves to bare necessities, to simple things, so much for themselves as for the monastery in general. All those things that lay people use to make their lives easier will enslave the monk instead of helping him. The monk must try to minimize his needs and simplify his life, otherwise he will not be set free. There's a difference between being clean and enjoying luxury. Using the same tool for different jobs will make the monk less demanding. At Sinai Monastery, I used a can, for making both tea and porridge. In general, it helps a lot to keep things simple. You should own simple and sturdy things. What is humble and simple is appreciated even by lay people, and it will certainly help the monk. It will remind him of poverty, of pain, and of the monastic life. Once, King George, in the early 20th century, visited the monastery of the great Lavra on Manathos, and the father served him on a silver tray. When he saw it, he said, "I was expecting something simpler from you, perhaps a wooden tray. I'm tired of silver trays." When St. Paisios was asked how a monk should use modern conveniences, he replied, "He should always have fewer and simpler things than the rest of the people. I feel much better when I use wood for heating and cooking and for handiwork." If a monk or a nun does not think in a monastic way, then everything becomes a necessity, and he becomes worse than those who live in the world. Monks and nuns must live in humbler circumstances than they did when they lived in the world, never better. We should not have better things here than we did at home. In general, the monastery must be poorer than the homes in which they were raised. This will help the monk with his interior life and will also be of help to lay people. God has provided that we do not find peace in possessions and comforts. If laymen are troubled by all these modern comforts, you can imagine how much more they trouble the monk. Secular people say, "How lucky are the wealthy people who live in palaces and have all kinds of conveniences." On the contrary, blessed are those who have succeeded in simplifying their lives, freeing themselves from the yoke of worldly progress, of the many conveniences that have become inconveniences, and have consequently rid themselves of the dreadful anxiety that plagues so many people today. The more people distance themselves from a natural and simple life and embrace luxury, the more that they suffer from anxiety. Worldly stress is the result of worldly happiness, worldly pleasures, and self-indulgence. I could ask others to help me take care of my hut, but I can make do with the way things are. Why should I spend money on a wall when there is so much need elsewhere? If I have a 500 drachma bill, I prefer to buy small crosses and icons and give them to someone in need to help him. It gives me great joy to give to others. Even if I need something, I will not spend the money on myself. You must pray and only do those chores that are absolutely necessary. All these things that usually take our time are really so short-lived. Is it worth wasting our time when so many are suffering and people are dying from starvation? The simple buildings and the humble belongings transport the monastics mentally to the caves and the austere dwellings of our holy fathers and are of great spiritual benefit. Worldly belongings remind monks of the world and turn them into secular souls. Christ was born in a manger. If we find comfort in worldly things, Christ will turn his back to us, something he never did to anyone. He will say, "I had nothing. Why did you need so much? Is that what is written in the Gospels? Did you see me do as you're doing? You do not live in the world. You are monks. What should I do with you? Where should I put you?" We should be worried about the right things. Christ will ask us what spiritual work we have accomplished, how we helped the world in spiritual matters. He will not ask what buildings we made. He will not even mention them. We will be held accountable for our spiritual progress. I want you to grasp what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying that one must not construct buildings and not construct them well, but one must take care of the spiritual life first and then mind the rest and do all that with spiritual discernment. End of quote, St. Paisios. Nevertheless, St. Paisios did acknowledge that monasteries involved in philanthropic work could have wealth and some modern conveniences. He said of St. Athanasios of Athos, "The monastery had 800 to 1,000 monks during his time. Many people sought help there. There were numerous poor and hungry people who gathered at the Lavra monastery to find food, to find shelter. He had to create a modern kind of oven so that he would have bread to give to the people. The Byzantine emperors had endowed the monasteries with a lot of property because they served as charitable institutions. The monasteries were established to help people spiritually and materially, which is why the emperors endowed them so well. According to the 13th century Typicon, for the monastery of the Archangel Michael, quote, the accumulation of wealth by monasteries is morally indefensible while others live in poverty. Specifically, it stated, quote, the superior should not be eager to store up money in the monastery. To those then who have renounced the world, and those in the world, and for this reason also the bitter ruler of this world, and who have promised to live on a higher plane and to partake of the angelic manner of life to the best of their strength, how much pardon would this practice deserve? Or what defense will those who, after their holy monastic promise, have engaged in such practices make to the implacable, fearsome judge? How can they enrich themselves while others in the world are poor and worn out by the deprivation of necessities? The Emperor Nikephoros Phokas, who nearly became a monk, declared in a novel, that is, a law which he ordained in the 10th century, the Word of God the Father, the Logos, taught us that wealth and many possessions prevent our salvation, and that it is difficult for the rich to enter the kingdom. He wanted us to live simply, so that he not only wanted us to have no staff, no bag, or a second tunic. See Luke 9, verse 3. But he even prohibited worrying about tomorrow's food. Matthew 6:34. But now I see in monasteries and sacred convents a conspicuous illness, and I call this greed an illness, and I know not what cure to contrive or how to correct the excess. What caused this? Which fathers taught them such extravagance and led them to false frenzies? Psalm 39, verse 6, to quote the divine David. They endeavor to acquire endless stretches of land, luxurious buildings, herds of horses, oxen, camels, and countless other animals. By directing all their soul's attention to these things, they have made the monastic life no different than the worldly life, even though God, on the contrary, has ordered us to be free of such things. For he said, do not worry about what to eat or to drink, and gave us example of the birds to reproach us. What did the divine apostle say? These hands ministered to my own needs and to the men who were with me. In Acts 20, verse 34, and if we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. 1 Timothy 6:8. Look at the lives of the Holy Fathers who shone forth in Egypt and Palestine, Alexandria, everywhere else, and you will find them living so frugally and simply that it was as if they only lived for their soul and approached the incorporeality of the angels. After all, Christ said that the kingdom belongs to the forceful, and the forceful seize it. Matthew 11:12. And that through many tribulations we must enter it. Matthew 11:12 and Acts 14:22. So, when I see those who have vowed to follow this kind of life and are marked for this lifestyle by the pledge of the schema, completely breaking their vows and contradicting the schema, I know not how to avoid calling this thing a farce. I would say that it blasphemes the name of Christ. End of quote. Nikephoros Phokas. This emperor's attempts to fight the illness of greed in some monasteries were apparently unsuccessful, considering that 2 centuries later, St. Eustathios of Thessaloniki addressed the same problem. Monastic life means a rejection of the world, not a desire for it. It means withdrawing from it, not approaching it. It is a life free of worldly cares, not a life full of them. But for you, renouncing the world has meant becoming more worldly. You are led away from your goal by working too much, which makes you worry about many things. You have abandoned your primary work while occupying yourselves with secondary matters. You are ignorant of the refined things that bring you in contact with angels, while you strive for coarse and heavy things by which the noose which God gave you is dragged down to the earth, paralyzed and unable to ascend. It is this kind of discordant, unharmonious, sloppy, and completely inappropriate behavior of these superficially great monks that the memorable emperors of old decided to prohibit in the monasteries that they themselves had established, as if they had foreseen what would happen if they would not take the certain wise measures. This counterfeit practice, which destroys monastic life, does not benefit the monks themselves and harms those who would imitate them." End of quote. In the same spirit, St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain warned his nuns to quote, "Unfortunately, the secular spirit has entered many monasteries because nowadays some fathers promote the monastic life through a secular channel and do not lead souls to the patristic spirit of grace. I discern an anti-patristic spirit prevailing in the monasteries today. They do not accept what is truly good, the tradition of the fathers of the church. They do not live in a patristic manner. Instead, they level the spiritual heights in the name of obedience and the breaking of the will, and then go on to serve their own secular desires. We should not aim to surpass the secular people in secular achievements. This secular progress harms even those who live in the world, let alone the monk. We should run so fast spiritually that lay people will be forced to do something. If we just behave like a very spiritual layperson, we will not help them because they already have an example of lay people who are highly spiritual. We must surpass them. Why don't we give some thought about the Holy Fathers whom we study continually, where and how they lived? The Lord said, 'The foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man hath nowhere to lay his head.' What a tremendous thing. And you see how they were trying to imitate Christ in those caves. They experienced Christ's joy because they emulated Christ in everything. Their full attention was focused on that one thing. The Holy Fathers had transformed the desert into a spiritual state, and we today are turning it into a secular state. While the Church of Christ is departing to the desert in order to be saved, we are converting the desert into a secular state, and we scandalize people who will not only remain helpless, but will have also nothing to hold on to. Today, there are monks who live the monastic life on the outside. They do not smoke, they live a chaste life, they read the Philokalia, and they constantly talk about the fathers of the church. They're not different from lay people, the kosmikos, who are pleased with themselves, because as children they did not tell any lies and always made the sign of the cross, or they went to church and later as adults were careful with moral matters. Well, that's what's happening in some monasteries today. And many lay people find that attractive. But as they get acquainted with the monks or the nuns, they realize that they maintain a secular spirit and are not really any different from people who live in the world. How can a monk move the heart of a layperson when he is spiritually drained? Alcohol will lose its pungency if we leave the bottle open. It can no longer kill germs, and neither will it ignite it if you light it. And if you put it in the gas stove or the lamp, it will also destroy the wick. Likewise, if the monk is not careful, he drives divine grace away, and in the end is left only with his monastic habit. He too will be like the alcohol that has lost its spark. He won't be able to cauterize the devil. Angels are a light for the monastics, and monastics are a light for men. Ladder of Divine Ascent. He will not even be a light to others. Do you realize how destructive this secular spirit is? If this true spirituality leaves monasticism, nothing will be left. The greatest contribution to society will be made by monasteries that do not have the secular mindset and have reached a spiritual state. They will not need to say much or to do anything else, because they will be able to speak through their way of life. This is what the world needs today. If we are to enjoy spiritual health and angelic delights, we must detach ourselves from the spirit of secular progress. Let us lay ourselves bare of wealth and our soul of passions, so that our life and mission as monks acquire meaning, for where there is material wealth, there is spiritual poverty. Likewise, a contemporary Athonite monk who became a metropolitan, Nikolaos Hatzidnikolai of Mesogai Lavrotiki, wrote, to quote from his work on the contribution of women's monasticism in the pastoral life of the Church, monasteries are traditionally known for their voluntary poverty, their frugality, and simplicity in living. The truth is that this tradition has been somewhat shaken in our days, but wherever it does exist, it gives the best answer to the deceit of hyper-consumerism and to the dead end of pleasure-seeking materialism. This constitutes the priceless treasure of monastic life, and it must in no way be lost. The narrow and low doors, the dimmed lighting, the lack of worldly comforts, the profound connection with nature and natural ways, make the outline of a very gentle life with an exceptionally frugal use of the senses that is certainly rare and especially brings rest. All these things are missing from contemporary life, but as a rule are endemic to monasteries. This is why every visit to a holy monastery, in addition to the blessing of the pilgrimage and the stillness found, the hezekiah, rewards people with a rare relaxation of their soul's deepest parts. Hezekiah, stillness, mortifies the outward senses and resurrects the inward movements, whereas an outward manner of life does the opposite. That is, it resurrects the outward senses and deadens the inward movements. The atmosphere of life in a monastery wakes up our inner world and gives rest to the natural man. The classic pastoral approach is usually based on knowing the customs of the contemporary world and era, and consequently on being completely informed and up to date. On the contrary, the monastic pastoral approach could draw its strength and base its outreach not on being up to date, but by relying on well-tested timelessness and by being qualitatively different. In other words, the more removed one becomes from the things of the world, the more one can help the world. End of quote, Metropolitan Nikolaos. To conclude, a counterintuitive benefit of poverty is that it actually makes one more eager to share instead of less eager. As Simon Sinek observed, when we have less, we tend to be more open to sharing what we have. A Bedouin tribe or a nomadic Mongolian family doesn't have much, yet they are happy to share because it is in their interest to do so, because their survival depends on sharing, for they know that they may be travelers in need of food and shelter one day. Ironically, the more we have, the bigger our fences, the more sophisticated our security systems to keep people away, and the less we want to share. One pitfall for successful monasteries is that their success can lead to a material wealth that distracts them from their spiritual goals. As one historian observed in regards to monasteries in Western Europe, ascetic work ethics and rational design of work roles made the medieval monasteries the most efficient production organizations of that time. They accumulated immeasurable wealth, which trapped those monks who strove for the monastic ideal of an ascetic life led in poverty and brought about severe conflicts. Thus, the medieval monastery became the first bureaucratic iron cage. Due to this phenomenon, by the 7th century, monasticism in Western Europe, which had originally arisen from the desire for self-mastery or self-transcendence and union with God, embracing the ideal of the voluntary removal of the individual from society, had become closely identified with landowning and the interests of royalty and aristocracy. Although St. Eustathius of Thessaloniki in the 12th century sharply criticized monks who made deliberate efforts to acquire wealth, he believed that it is not reprehensible but even praiseworthy for them to become rich when someone bestows wealth on them out of reverence for their virtuous lifestyle. However, this opinion of his conflicts with the stance of the many monastic saints quoted earlier in this chapter. 5. Luxury. Luxurious living is diametrically opposed to a life devoted to God. The Apostle Paul wrote that a celibate woman ostensibly dedicated to God, that liveth in pleasure, is dead while she liveth. 1 Timothy 5:6. St. Cyril of Jerusalem warned, Every worldly luxury is sweet at the time it is used, but it greatly darkens and terribly inebriates him who accepts it. St. Isaac the Syrian emphasized the importance of avoiding comforts and embracing hardships. Quote, a man can never learn what divine power is while he abides in comfort and a spacious living. You wish to ascend to heaven, to receive that kingdom, communion with God, the consolation of the spiritual goods of yonder blessedness, the fellowships of the angels, and the immortal life, and you ask if this path requires toil. Great is this marvel. It is the spirit of the devil, not the spirit of God, that dwells in those who pass their life in ease. The Spirit of God is not pleased with bodily comforts, nor does he find a life of ease acceptable, but one of hardship. Ascetical Homily 60. One of those who love God, that is St. Paul, said, I have given oath that I die daily, 1 Corinthians 15:31. By this the sons of God are set apart from the rest of mankind. They live in afflictions, but the world rejoices in luxury and ease. For it is not God's good pleasure that those whom he loves should live in ease while they are in the flesh. He wishes them rather, so long as they are in this life, to abide in affliction, in oppression, in weariness, in poverty, in nakedness, isolation, want, sickness, degradation, buffetings, contrition of heart, bodily hardship, renunciation of relatives, and sorrowful thought. He wishes them to possess an aspect differing from all creation, a habitation unlike that of the rest of men, and to live in a solitary and quiet dwelling unknown to the sight of men, and bereft of any sign of the gladdening things of this life. Mourning is to be found within their dwelling, and cheerfulness far from it. Distresses press frequently upon it, nor do they fully have the body's needs as do the rest of men. Their bedding is the ground. They are somber, but the world is joyous. They fast, but the world lives in pleasure. End of quote from Homily 60 of St. Isaac the Syrian. The 7th century Celtic rule of Carthage includes restraint in the use of comforts as one of the basic characteristics of monastics. St. Gregory Palamas said that wealth and luxury prevent the ripening of the spiritual fruits worthy of the divine harvest. According to St. Joseph the Hesychist, one does not become a monk through luxury and comforts. The following incident from his life reveals that he even believed that luxuries hinder a monk's prayer and deprive him of the right to ask God for mercy. Quote from My Elder Joseph the Hesychist, written by Elder Ephraim, page 583. Using all the money he had earned through iconography, Father John had bought the most luxurious items, sofas, fancy chandeliers, and even a gas-powered refrigerator. Such things were unheard of on the Holy Mountain in those days. When St. Joseph the Hesychist saw all this, he sadly commented, Can a monk living in a place like this say, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me? He has already received mercy. I doubt a person can say the prayer in here. In the same spirit, St. Sophronia of Essex said, When we're truly broken, that is humble, God hears our prayers. When we are comfortable, he does not answer. St. John Chrysostom preached that luxuries harm the body and blind the soul. To quote from the Golden Mouth's homilies on the epistles of Paul to the Corinthians, Now then, that the unbelievers should have these feelings of sadness due to the fleeting nature of pleasures is no marvel. But when they who have partaken of so great mysteries and learned such high rules of self-denial concerning things to come, delight to dwell in things present, what indulgence do they deserve? None. Whence then arises their loving to dwell in the present things? From giving their mind over to luxury, and their darkening, the fattening of their flesh, and making their soul delicate, and rendering their burden heavy, and their darkness great, and their veil thick. For in luxury the better part is enslaved, but the worse prevails, and the former is blinded on every side and dragged on in its maimed condition, while the other drags and leads men about everywhere, though it ought to be in the rank of things that are led. It is not the body which blinds the soul, far from it, O man, but the luxury. If this is how he warned laymen of the harm of luxuries, one could only imagine how he would have censured monastics living in luxury. For the following teaching of his shows that he associated voluntary virginity with voluntary poverty. Quote, in truth, there is a great difference between virtue and evil, and a great difference. One is wide and easy, but the other is narrow and full of tribulation. Luxury is wide and easy, but poverty and need are narrow and full of tribulation. So just as in this life the ways are opposed, the person who chooses virginity travels the narrow road of tribulation, and so does the person who pursues chastity, embraces voluntary poverty, and scorns vainglory. So also in the time of punishment and recompense, there is a great distance to be found between their requitals. St. Lazarus of Mount Galician taught that comforts destroy monasticism. The fathers of old always sought out the deserts and the most uncomfortable places, not those which had springs and leafy trees and other physical comforts. For this reason, they were well able to subordinate their irrational carnal impulses because they did not easily find the materials that beget the passions. For in the skeet of Egypt, just as the Holy Fathers themselves predicted, as long as the place was uncomfortable, it abounded in the lodgings and dwellings of the monks. But from the moment when, one after another, they began to transport fertile soil from elsewhere for growing vegetables, and set up trees and cisterns in front of their doors, the skeet went into decline and was delivered to destruction. End of quote. From the life of Lazarus of Mount Galician. St. Maximus the Confessor likewise observed that comforts destroy a monk. He wrote, the achievements of worldly people constitute the failings of monks, and the achievements of monks constitutes the failings of worldly people. For example, the achievements of worldly people are wealth, fame, power, luxury, comfort, children, and what is consequent upon all these things. But the monk is destroyed if he obtains any of them. His achievements are the total shedding of possessions, the lack of fame, lack of power, of self-control, hardship, and all that is consequent upon them. Philokalia, Volume 2, Chapter 85 of Maximus the Confessor. St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain ridiculed the monastic pursuit of conveniences in his epistles, page 56 and following. Quote, who could doubt that with all the modern conveniences the monastery can function more easily? If every monk could have his mother by his side to take care of him, no doubt, that would also be convenient. And if there were a tape player in the church playing the prayers, that would also be very relaxing. But still more soothing would it be if the stasides, the stalls, the wooden seats in the church were converted into beds. It would also certainly be relaxing for an ascetic if he had a small machine made just for the turning of his comboschini, his prayer rope, and a phony straw ascetic to do his prostrations and the prayer ropes, while he could go get on a soft mattress to lie down and rest his worn-out flesh. Without a doubt, all of these things comfort the flesh but leave the soul empty and miserable, besides generating feminine sentimentality and worldly anxiety. All monks should avoid as much as possible modern means in the operation of the monastery, and should respect the desert by adapting to it. Then the desert will grant us its divine stillness, its holy Hezekiah, and we shall be assisted in the desertion of our souls from the passions. It is not right to want to adapt the desert to our worldly self, for it is a sin to abuse the desert. Any of the modernistic monks may build a monastery on top of an apartment building so that he may have all the conveniences of the world he wants, and so that he may enjoy the city lights and ascend to the third heaven via the elevator, and let him leave the desert in peace. The greatest enemy of our soul's salvation, and even greater than the devil, is the worldly spirit, for it sweetly misleads us and in the end eternally embitters us. Yet, if we saw the devil himself, we would be terrified and forced to run to God, and then we would secure paradise. Monks who compete with worldly people in all fields of worldly development reveal that they have taken a wrong turn. Besides, they themselves are able to perceive this in the worldly anxieties that they suffer. End of quote, St. Paisios. Metropolitan Nicolaus Hazi-Nicolai also lamented the modernization of Mount Athos, and he wrote in his book, Mount Athos, the Highest Place on Earth, 2007, page 136, following, quote, "You meet God more easily walking along a path than on the road in a car, with its exhaust fumes, the clouds of dust, and the noise, the speed, and the convenience. For the gate is small, and the way is narrow that leads to life," Matthew 7:14. "The feet are replaced by wheels. Exhaust fumes take the place of exertion. Instead of the sense of the nature, there is the stench of petrol or diesel fumes. Instead of an animal, we see an engine. Instead of feeling the heat of the sun on one's face, the dust of the road covers one's hair and clothes. We replace what is natural and divine with the arrogance of human achievement." End of quote. Henry David Thoreau's experiment of living a simple life in the wilderness for 2 years led him to discover that simplicity fosters a deeper understanding of life, which makes one more, quote, awake, and able to, quote, live deliberately, whereas luxuries do the opposite. He wrote in Walden on page 142, "Only 1 in a million is awake enough for effective intellectual exertion. Only 1 in 100 million to a poetic or divine life. To be awake is to be alive. I have never yet met a man who was quite awake. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die discover that I had not lived. I wanted to live deep, and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to rout all that was not life. Most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only not indispensable, but positive hindrances to the elevation of mankind. In proportion as he simplifies his life, the laws of the universe will appear less complex, and solitude will not be solitude, nor poverty, poverty, nor weakness, weakness." End of quote, Henry David Thoreau. Saint Sophronia of Essex believed that seeking comfort and less menial tasks in a monastery are petty desires stemming from lack of faith that ruin monasticism. He said, "If we have firm faith, we can make our life in the monastery truly suitable for eternal salvation, and this is a heavenly mystery. But if in the monastery we seek petty things such as comfort and tasks not so menial, then everything surely will go to waste. Remember the noteworthy maxim that a monk on the holy mountain once told me. There is no task that in itself debases the grandeur of man's being. Only sin debases the divine life within us. And I will add that the most suitable tasks for monastic life are those from which we do not run the risk of acquiring passions." One ascetic elder in the Eurondikon was asked, "Why, Father, is it not possible for those of our generation to maintain the ascetic life of the fathers before us?" "Because," the Yerunda answered, "it neither loves God, nor does it flee away from people, nor does it disdain the material goods of this world. For in the soul of a man who flees from other men and from materialism, there begins to be born a spontaneous contrition and desire for the ascetic life. A man, if he does not flee to a place where he earns his bread only with great labor, cannot succeed in the ascetic life." An abbot of a monastery asked Abba Piman, "How can I acquire the fear of God?" Abba Piman replied, "How can we acquire the fear of God when our belly is full of cheese and preserved foods?" Nevertheless, St. Basil the Great recommended moderation between abstinence and luxury. Quote, "The best rule and standard for abstinence is this, to seek neither luxury nor mortification of the flesh, but to avoid the immoderation of both, so that the body may neither be disordered by obesity, nor yet rendered sickly and so unable to perform the commandments. Although St. Joseph the Hesychist lived most of his life with tremendous deprivation and asceticism, he would have agreed with this moderate approach. For he said, quote, "The conclusion I have drawn now, after so many years and so much asceticism, is that the ideal monastic path is to find a spiritual guide, to have light physical labor, and to have a schedule for prayer and fasting." Yet, in churches and chapels of a monastery, many saints of the church wanted to use the absolutely best materials. For example, St. Neophytos, the founder of Dokoriou Monastery at Manathos, wrote, from the Byzantine monastic foundation documents again, "I added, quote, to the existing buildings the most precious cloths, and holy silver vessels, and all venerable icons and holy books, and I erected this most sacred and holy church, and I adorned it with every beauty within my power, and as such I presented it for all to see. Nevertheless, all these things are for the glory and praise of God, and not for my own vain satisfaction." End of quote. Likewise, St. Cesarius of Arlis and St. Donatus of Bescanon wrote in their monastic rules, "You will not use silver except in the services of the oratory." Elder Ephrem also believed that monastery churches should be richly adorned. One day during a meal in Trapeza, when the reading was the life of a Byzantine monastic saint that described how he adorned the church he built, Elder Ephrem leaned toward me and whispered with a smile, "Do you see how lavishly he adorned his church?" Some saints, however, had a different approach and believed that even a church should be unadorned. For example, St. Nilus Sorsky wrote, concerning the adornments of churches, St. John Chrysostom writes, "If anyone should wish to donate sacred utensils or any other adornment for the church, tell him to distribute his money to the poor, for no one has ever been judged for not decorating the church." And other saints say the same thing. St. Eugenia, the martyr, also, when sacred silver vessels were offered to her, said, "It is not fitting for a religious in a monastery to have silver possessions. For this reason, it is not fitting that we also should possess gold and silver objects, not even for sacred vessels and other necessary adornments, except to have only the bare necessities for the church." Nil Sorsky. Similarly, when St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain was asked how much decoration is appropriate in a church, he replied, "Considering the era in which we live, which is not Byzantium, the simpler the decoration is, even in a church, the better, for simplicity always helps." 6. Health. Just as the soul is more noble and important than the body, so the primary emphasis of a monastery should be on facilitating health of soul. But since the body is also God's special creation, and since health of body is conducive to health of soul, physical health should be cared for as well. As St. Nectarius of Egina explained, quote, "On account of this mutual influence of soul and body, then, if man is to be happy, if he is to act in a way worthy of his calling, he needs to be healthy on both fronts, since without both being in good condition, he is unable to be happy and cannot be fit to perform the work of his calling. Since there are many things which undercut the health and the well-being of the soul and body, man therefore ought to take great care to fortify both, so as to keep them strong and robust. Thus they will be able to repel the innumerable assaults of enemies, and be ready and prepared to enjoy that happiness which comes from the well-being of the two parts of the self, and at the same time be able to fulfill the work of his calling. Wherefore, as all know well, the training and exercise of both body and soul are inborn duties set upon man by both his very nature and his calling, since a heavenly body serves the soul willingly and readily, while a soul which has cultivated its faculties is sound, healthy, and governs the body prudently." St. Nectarios. Likewise, St. Joseph the Hesychist observed that when the body is sick, quote, "the soul suffers along with the body, even though the former is spiritual and bodiless. Then the nous is unable to produce its noetic movements because it is hobbling together with the body. And the demons excite carnal passions more than other passions when the body is exhausted and has collapsed. Since contemporary medical experts agree that physical health depends primarily on proper diet, sufficient physical activity, medical attention, and the avoidance of toxic substances, a monastery should provide for these four fundamentals. Moreover, since an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, the painless and inexpensive task of caring for physical health in this manner will save one from the painful and expensive task of trying to remedy health problems that arise due to neglecting one's health. Although some of the Holy Fathers felt that resorting to physicians evinced a lack of faith in God, St. Basil the Great taught, "The medical art has been vouchsafed us by God." In the same spirit, St. Barnusius the Great wrote to a monk, "We should not, however, place all our hope in these medicines, but only in the God who grants death and life, who says, 'I shall wound and I shall heal,' Deuteronomy 32, verse 39. When you read these medical books and ask others about these matters, do not forget that without God there can be no healing." St. Joseph the Hesychist at first wanted to heal others only through faith, prayer, fasting, but later he changed his approach and he wrote, quote, "I am beginning to learn that both medicines and grace are necessary." Monastic Wisdom, page 244. To continue. Eating unhealthy foods, that is junk food, sweets, sodas, high-processed foods, and so forth, would be contrary to the principle of caring for bodily health and of not spending money on luxuries. In the words of St. Basil the Great, "Whatever food is calculated to relieve our need for nourishment with the least trouble, this is to be employed. Nothing, in fact, that is known to be harmful should be partaken of, for it is not reasonable to take food for nourishment which from within us would make war upon the body and hinder it in the accomplishment of the precept. Furthermore, we should prefer by all means whatever is most easily procurable and not concern ourselves with costly fare, and seek to obtain extravagant foods with expensive sauces on the pretext of continency. On the contrary, we should choose whatever is easy to obtain in each region, cheap, and available for general consumption, and use only those imported foods that are necessary to sustain life, like olive oil and similar products." End of quote. In the same spirit, Abbot Dorotheus told his monks, "A man is perfectly able to satisfy the needs of his body with bread, vegetables, and a few olives, but he gives up doing so and seeks something more tasty and more expensive. All this is against the conscience." St. Joseph the Hesychist wrote to a layman, "Take control of your appetite and don't eat things that you know will harm your health. Fried foods, salty foods, sauces, pork, meats, salted fish, alcoholic drinks in general." Elder Ephraim preferred organic foods, and he frequently avoided produce when he found out that it was not organic. St. Basil the Great was concerned that laymen would be scandalized if they saw monastics preoccupied with gratifying their appetites with tasty foods. He wrote in his monastic rules, quote, that we should run about searching for anything edible not demanded by real necessity, but calculated to provide a wretched delight and ruinous vainglory, is not only shameful and out of keeping with our avowed purpose, but it also causes harm of no mean gravity when they who spend their lives in sensual gratification and measure happiness in terms of pleasure for the appetite see us also taken up with the same preoccupations which keep them enthralled. Several of the Holy Fathers recommend avoiding all delicious food, for example, St. Basil the Great. He wrote that we should satisfy our need with the plainer foods and those necessary to sustain life, avoid the evil of taking our fill of them, and abstaining absolutely from those foods whose sole purpose is to give delight. He also wrote, continency has only one rule: complete abstinence from all that tends to harmful pleasure. The reason for this, according to St. Isidore of Seville, is that a monk should curb the cravings of his palate, because by growing accustomed to renouncing pleasures, he will be able to control his lust. Nevertheless, Many contemporary Athonite elders, including elders Ephraim and Emilianos, would offer sweets to their disciples because they could see that the pleasure of tasting something delicious from time to time would lead them to glorify God rather than increase their passions. They also instructed the monastery's cook to serve foods that are both nourishing and tasty. 7. Aesthetics. A monastery belongs to God and therefore should be a place of beauty. Granted, a few monastic saints turned away from the beauty of nature because it distracted them from their intense prayer. For example, in the early days of monasticism, Mother Sarah, who dwelt above the river and was 60 years old, had never looked out from her abode and seen the river. Commenting on this, Saint Anatoly Zertzal of Optina said, "Identify more with those saints who loved nature, like Saint Sergius Radonezh, Saint Sava of Zenogorod, Saint Anthony and Theodosi. They chose the most beautiful locations for their monasteries because nature raises man up to God." In order to make a monastery beautiful, it should be aesthetically pleasing to all 5 senses. 1. It should be pleasing to the eyes by consisting of beautiful, clean, and well-kept buildings, gardens, and landscaping. Every item should be kept in its place so that it can be easily found and so that things are not scattered around in a disorderly manner. Studies have shown that people living in a disorganized place have a higher risk for heart disease, are less active, are more depressed and fatigued, have higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol, have greater difficulty working efficiently and focusing on a particular task, sleep less well, and waste more time. Only the absolutely most necessary items should be kept, since 80% of things kept are never used, and since getting rid of clutter eliminates 40% of the housework. Pertinent footnotes to that section. Elder Frem emphasized keeping the monastery clean. Once he was upset with me when he saw me pass by a small piece of paper outside without picking it up and throwing it away. Yoronda Macrina also believed that a monastery should look tidy. It is forbidden to hang blankets and other clothes on the balconies where all the visitors can see them. Rule number 29 from Yorondisa. Also, one study found that women who described their living spaces as cluttered or full of unfinished projects were more likely to be depressed and fatigued than women who described their homes as restful and restorative. And specifically, researchers found that the visual cortex can be overwhelmed by task-irrelevant objects, making it harder to allocate attention and complete tasks efficiently. To continue. 2. It should be pleasing to the ears by having traditional Orthodox chanting in the services, by not using loud machinery, by discouraging people from shouting, and by disallowing conversations during rest times. 3. It should be pleasing to the nose by minimizing the use of machines that pollute the atmosphere, and by having plenty of flowers and trees as St. Nectarius of Egina and Elder Ephraim wanted for their monasteries. But we should avoid using perfumes for our rooms, clothes, or bodies, since this is condemned by the prophet Amos. Quote, "Woe to those who drink wine in bowls and anoint themselves with the finest oils." Amos, chapter 6, verse 6. And the prophet Isaiah, quote, "The Lord will smite the heads of the daughters of Zion. Instead of perfumes there will be rottenness, and instead of a rich robe, a girding of sackcloth." Isaiah 3:17-24. St. Gregory, the theologian, quote, "Let us be healed also in the smell, that we be not effeminate, and be sprinkled with dust instead of sweet perfumes. And angels walking upon earth are they who practice chastity. Let all vain adornment be banished, and perfume enticing to pleasure." And Clement of Alexandria, footnote, "The use of crowns and ointments is not necessary for us, for it impels to pleasures and indulgences, especially on the approach of night. I know that the woman brought to the sacred supper an alabaster box of ointment, Matthew 26, verse 7, and anointed the feet of the Lord and refreshed him. But the woman, not having yet received the word, for she was still a sinner, honored the Lord with what she thought the most precious thing in her possession was, the ointment. I know, too, the words of Aristippus the Cyrenian. Aristippus was a luxurious man. He asked an answer to a sophisticated proposition in the following terms. A horse anointed with ointment is not injured in his excellence as a horse, nor is a dog which has been anointed in his excellence as a dog, no more is a man. He added it, and so finished. But the dog and the horse take no account of the ointment, whilst in the case of those whose perceptions are more rational, applying girlish sense to their persons, its use is more censurable. Day by day their thoughts are directed to the gratification of insatiable desire, to the exhaustless varieties of fragrance, wherefore also they are redolent of any excessive luxuriousness, and they fumigate and sprinkle their clothes, their bedclothes, and their houses. Luxury all but compels vessels for the meanest uses. To smell of perfume, it is highly requisite for the men who belong to us to give forth the odor not of ointments, but of nobleness and goodness. And let woman breathe the odor of the true royal ointment, that of Christ, not of unguents and scented powders, and let her always be anointed with the ambrosial chrism of modesty, and find delight in the holy unguent, the Spirit. End of footnote. To return. Clement of Alexandria, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, and St. Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. Besides, 95% of scented items nowadays derive their fragrance from artificial chemicals, many of which have been proven to be toxic, rather than from fragrances that are naturally found in God's creation. Footnote from Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain's Handbook of Spiritual Counsel. One must guard the sense of smell, pure from the fragrances of myrrhs and perfumes, for they not only weaken the manly character of the soul and make it effeminate, but they, more than any other thing, also incite the soul toward fornication and other moral licentiousness. As external assaults upon the senses bring about a corresponding tendency and change in the body, likewise the changes in the body affect corresponding changes in the soul. Marcus Aurelius had the habit of using expensive and sweet-smelling myrrh in his lamps, so that as it burned he would be pleased by its fragrance. Behold, what level of foolishness the hedonistic desire to please the sense of smell can reach. Not far from this foolishness is also the habit of those who attempt to please all their senses through the use of fragrances in general. They like to add fragrant substances to everything, to their foods, their drinks, their clothes, their mattresses, and so forth. If you really want your body to be fragrant and to exude a pleasant odor, do not remain idle. Move it, work it, and force yourself. Do 50 or even 100 prostrations every day and as many reverences as you can. In parentheses, note this advice of St. Nicodemus was not addressed to monks, but to the lay people. Bodily activity naturally generates heat, which makes the body thin and evaporates or digests its superfluous liquids. This is why the bodies of virtually all the craftsmen and laborers, and especially of ascetic monks, do not exude any heavy odor, but rather exude a pleasant and fragrant odor. End of quote from a Handbook of Spiritual Counsel. 4. It should be pleasing in the sense of touch by keeping buildings at a moderate temperature. And 5. It should be pleasing to the sense of taste by serving wholesome and healthy foods. Caution is needed to avoid excessive decoration. St. Theodore of Synaxar wrote in the Rule for Nuns, "Every luxury, worldly entertainment, or excessive decoration of the cell is strictly forbidden, just as is the use of anything silk or colored other than cotton or wool material of exclusively black color." Little Russian Philokalia, Volume 5, St. Theodore of Synaxar. St. Paisios of the Holy Mountain warned that these worldly decorations can captivate our heart. From With Pain and Love for Contemporary Man, page 74. Quote, "We must avoid worldly things and not let them occupy our heart. We must use only the simplest means to accommodate our needs. We must make sure, however, that the few things we use are solid. If I use a beautiful thing, I give all my heart to that beauty, and I leave nothing to God. You pass by somewhere and you see a house with pretty marble work, designs, engravings. You admire the stones, the bricks, and you leave your heart there. Women are especially vulnerable to this kind of deception. Few of them do not waste their hearts on vanities. What I'm trying to say is that the devil robs them of their rich heart through all these ephemeral, colorful, and shiny trinkets. Let's say one of them needs a plate. She will search for the one with a flowery pattern on it, as if the food would turn sour if the plate had no flowers. Some spiritual women may instead be moved by serious patterns, such as a double-headed eagle and so on. And they wonder, why don't spiritual things touch me? How can the heart be moved by spiritual things when it is scattered in cabinets and plates? End of quote, St. Paisios. Footnote on toxicity. Until the 20th century, perfumes were made from natural ingredients derived directly from plants and animals. As fragrances became more widespread, they also became more synthetic. The National Academy of Sciences reports that 95% of the chemicals used in fragrances today are synthetic compounds derived from petroleum, including known toxins capable of causing cancer, birth defects, central nervous system disorders, and allergic reactions. Fragrance chemicals do not end with a bottle of perfume or cologne. They can be found in common items such as hair care products, hairsprays, deodorants, body lotions, sunscreens, aftershaves, shaving gels, as well as laundry detergents, fabric softeners, dryer sheets, scented plug-ins, scented candles, potpourri, alleged air fresheners, most cleaning products, antibacterial creams, disinfectants, magazines, and even in trash bags and pesticides, and the list goes on and on. Many chemicals used to make perfumes and other scented products are listed on the Environmental Protection Agency hazardous waste list. Medical conditions generally aggravated by exposure are kidney disorders, liver disorders, heart disorders, skin disorders, headache, giddiness, stupor, irritability, fatigue, tingling in the limbs. When absorbed and stored in body fat, it metabolizes to carbon monoxide, reducing oxygen carrying capability of the blood. This ingredient, formerly used in chemical warfare, can cause loss of memory and muscle control, brain damage, problems with speech, hearing, and vision. Citation from a book called Get a Whiff of This.